The radical, fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
Try to fix this. Sorry about all of that. I don't know why this piece of software seems to crash. Here we go.
The radical, fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, welcome everybody on this Saturday. I hope you're having a great weekend. Welcome to Yaron Brook Show. And Happy New Year, I guess. Maybe today will be the last day we use Happy New Year. Maybe tomorrow. We'll see. We'll let it go through the weekend. But I hope you all have a fantastic 2020. I'm certainly looking forward to this upcoming year. And to doing lots of shows with you guys. And definitely let me know what topics you would like me to cover. All right, so the other day I got a question in the Q&A in the Super Chat. And by the way, Super Chat is open today, so it's not going to be a very topic-heavy day today. So feel free to ask questions in the Super Chat. I got a question in the Super Chat the other day about hypergamy, and hypergamy is not exactly an idea, concept, a field that I am interested in, or that I have any expertise in, or that I've done any particular research in. So I said, I don't know what that is, and then the questioner provided a definition, and I commented on the particular definition that they provided. Which might or might not be a good definition. The more I look into this, it was probably a pretty bad definition that the guy gave for what it is. So now, while I think that everything I said during the show was right, there's more to be said on this topic, and I think there's something more broadly to be said about the dangers of evolutionary psychology and about the dangers of social science research more broadly, that I think that this kind of issue, the issue of hypergamy, brings out. So hypergamy is the idea that women in particular have a preference for marrying up. And marrying up means based on social status, based on income, based on caste, based on education, but based on features like that for women. But there are those who argue that men have also this hypergamy can be applied to men. And in the case of men, hypergamy applies to men who are trying to, who are attracted. Hypergamy applies to men in that men are trying to marry up, but they're trying to marry up in looks, in attractiveness, in physical appearances. So it makes men particularly seem shallow. Women, at least, you have to have some competency in order to I guess, be productive, but which is what, at the end of the day, it seems like what they mean by women marrying up. Men marrying up means just physical looks, which is completely an accident of nature. So there, you can find dozens of websites online that deal with these kind of stories, that deal with these ideas, and they give women strategies on how to appeal to men of a higher status, and they give men strategies on how to get more attractive women, or how to play the game of all of this. And I find the whole thing ludicrous and absurd and fairly disgusting, I think. Because what it fundamentally rejects, and what I think, unfortunately, much of evolutionary psychology fundamentally rejects, is what makes us human. What it fundamentally assumes is that we're just guided, we're just automatons, driven by some kind of genes, playing out some kind of genetic game, playing out some kind of gene mating strategies that have nothing to do with reason, that have nothing to do with choice, that have nothing to do with preferences, with ideas, with values, nothing to do with values. You'd never have any discussion of values in any of these websites, in any of these discussions. And when you look at the social sciences that study this, and they see X number of women marry up and men marry down, and they define up and down in various ways. First, I often find that the math doesn't work. If everybody marries up, how does that work? Because let's assume, just for the sake of it, that 50% men and 50% women. If all the women marry up, that's like all the children in Lake Wobegon. No, it's something like that. Anyway, it's something like Wobegon. All the children would be in Lake Wobegon being above average. Not everybody can be up. Unless women start much lower than men, so for every woman there's a man who constitutes up for her. I mean, the whole thing. So the math often doesn't add up, because it turns out most people get married at least once in life. By the time you reach 75, 85, about 96% of all people who reach that age have been married at least once. But they couldn't have married up. Not all the men could have married so-called attractive women, and not all the women could have married so-called up men at a higher status, it just doesn't work mathematically. And then how they define up and how they define attractive, and different cultures define attractive and up differently. And then, the studies, so this is the problem I see with so first I think everything is value devoured. But deeper than that, all of these studies are reason devoured. There's no reason, there's no choice, there's no thinking about who you want to spend time with. Think about who you want to have sex with, not sex as an animalistic, just material, physical thing, but sex as a full spiritual, intimate act. None of that is in consideration. Your spiritual benefits of mating, they even call it mating preferences, as if we're animals. I mean animals in the sense that we are animals, but animals in the sense of not having the capacity of free will, not having reason, not being rational beings. And this, again, is the problem with most evolutionary psychology and a lot of social sciences. They study people as they are. They ask people questions about how they behave. And a lot of people in the world in which we live, because of altruism, because of our educational system, because the human species has only been enlightened for a few hundred years, still behave like pretty primitive animals, pretty primitive human beings. And therefore they conclude, because a majority of people behave in a particular way, they conclude that we are genetically programmed to behave in that particular way. And that's how human beings behave. Of course, they can't then explain the outliers, people who don't behave in that way. In other words, most of the social sciences measure how people are rather than how they should be. Whether they're how they could be. Now, I'm not talking about some Marxist idea of perfecting the human being. But to be a human being, to be a full human being, to live as a human being, to maximize one's potential as a human being, requires effort. It requires engagement. It actually requires applying reason on a regular, steady basis to your life. It requires engaging your mind in making choices, in evaluating options, in accumulating data and evaluating facts and discarding non-facts and putting your emotions in your right place. You have to live up to Aristotle's term of a rational man. Now, other animals are not like this. Other animals cannot live up or down. They just are what they are. They have no choice in the matter. You cannot become a better cat. A cat is a cat. Cat A is not the same as cat B, but it is cat A, and it can't choose to be better. It can't activate a part of itself through free will to become a better image of a cat. But human beings can. It's just so sciences not only need to study how human beings behave, but more importantly, we need to understand how people should and could behave. What the potential is for human beings. Indeed, that is what morality, as one field, should be studying. Like Adam Smith, for example, when he does morality, if you read The Theory of Moral Sentiments, he takes the way people behave generally, as a standard of morality. So he lives in a Christian era. People's perception of morality is what morality is. And then he examines how they behave, and he looks for people who are more consistent versus people less consistent. He says, well, here's what the more consistent people do, and this is what morality is. So he accepts the status quo. He accepts the Christian morality is morality and then describes it. So a theory of moral sentiment is more a description of how people engage in a Christian morality than a theory of morality or a presentation of a moral code. And most social sciences, that's what they do. They describe rather than telling people how. What people who give people advice about relationships should be doing is not giving you strategies on how to assume the other sex has no free will and is just playing mating strategies because your whole purpose in life is to have sex, and if you're a man, to leave your seed in as many women as possible, and if you're a woman, to catch a man so they can take care of your baby. But what people should be talking about is how to create a meaningful relationship that bonds you of shared values, of shared respect and admiration, irrespective of what caste you come from or what class you come from. But what is admirable about the other person, defining for yourself what you're looking for. Not in your preconceptual state. And this is the thing, right? Because reason requires effort, many people don't engage in that effort. Therefore, many people are preconceptual. In other words, they're basically moved by percepts, by what they see and observe directly without abstracting away, without thinking, and by their emotions, which are consequence of conclusions they come to that, again, are not very conceptual, are not based on thinking, but based on perceptual observation. And I see this in economics. Why is it so hard for people to see the win-win inherent in trade? Because, and I know a lot of you, why is it so hard to explain that socialism doesn't work? Why is it so, it seems so simple, it seems so obvious. But think about trade, win-win nature of trade. Why is it so hard for people to hold that? Well, because perceptually, the world looks like a zero-sum game. I give up my $1,000, I get an iPhone. I got a thing, and $1,000 are gone, and no value seems to have been created. You have to actually engage a process of thought to conclude, well, no, I have more value than I gave up, and Apple has more value than they gave up. But that requires another step. Most people don't engage in that step. Most people stay at the perceptual level and assume that everybody else stays at the perceptual level. So what happens is the evolutionary psychologists come in and say, oh, we're programmed to view the world zero-sum. No, we're not. I mean, in a sense we are. In a sense that unless we engage our conceptual faculty, the world appears zero-sum. But as human beings, what makes us human is engaging that faculty. So instead of telling us, well, we're genetically made up this way. No, we're genetically made up to use our reason if we choose to do it. But you can't have choice in the social sciences. Free will screws all their data up. Free will screws up all their so-called science. So they don't have free will. They don't introduce free will. They don't recognize free will. It's too messy. And I see this in every field where I read up a little bit about either evolutionary psychology or about these studies that human beings behave this way or that way, and women have these kind of preferences or men have these kind of preferences. Which men, which women? Are they rational men, rational women? Those are the only people I really care about. Why do averages matter? Why do majorities matter? It's not indicative of anything other than it's indicative of a unthinking mentality. And so many people are unthinking. Right? So I think you have to be very, very careful in reading social sciences data, social sciences experiments, social sciences, because the fact is that what is true of unthinking majorities, unthinking masses, is not true of you. Right. So I really encourage you to think in terms of what is rational rather than thinking in terms of mating strategies, which is just the elevation is irrationality. I mean, really? I mean, it's again the same kind of attitude that Ben Shapiro has when he said that selfishness means if there's an attractive woman at the bar, you abandon your wife, you abandon your kids, and you run off to have sex with her. Yes, if you view human beings as unthinking, as not having values, as not being able to conceive of a long term, as not being able to conceive of spiritual values, as not being able to conceive of anything beyond some urge to mate. But we're not just animals with an urge to mate. We're far more complex beings with the capacity to choose, to reason, to think, to evaluate, to project into the future, to understand that sex and marriage and relationships have far greater implications than just the physical act itself. And that indeed the physical act itself loses much of its meaning and its pleasure when it's devoid of the other aspects related to sex. It's just the woman at the bar stops being attractive. Jacob says, if I model a population's behavior, the model should describe the population behavior as it is now, not how I think they should be. Yes, that's true, but to extrapolate from that to human nature is wrong. Because human nature is not about how they are. Human nature, as I understand it, is how they could and should be. All right. So yes, I'm not saying if the social science is just saying this is how the population behaves, that's fine. But if then it extrapolates from that behavior to human nature, that's where the danger is. And that's where it's completely wrong. Let's see. Robert asks a strange question, I think. What if Howard Roark wasn't a great architect? Okay. I mean, remember, Howard Roark was a fictional character. And in the fiction, he is presented as a great architect, period. What if all those who opposed him on his artistic integrity were right? In a different book, should an artist continue? No, if you're not producing value, if you're not a great architect, then why would you continue? Why would you continue to do something you're not good at? It would be boring, uninteresting, and depressing to do things that you're not good at. Find something that you're decently good at. I don't think he was as great as he thought he was. How do you know that? You can't think how great he was or he wasn't because you're not in the novel. I mean, that's a weird context. Ayn Rand created a character of a great architect. Whether you think he was great or not is irrelevant. By what standard? Have you seen his buildings? Right? Now, you might say I disagree with the architectural philosophy. That's fine. But it's irrelevant. I mean, you'd be wrong. But it's irrelevant. It's a novel. It presents a particular point of view. So the question doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. I'm not sure what the question is. I mean, in real life, should an artist continue if they're no good at what they do? The answer is no, they shouldn't. Generally, you should find something you're decent at, and not relative to other people. I mean, relative to other people in the sense of you're creating value. Are you good, objectively good at what you do? All right, any other questions on this evolutionary psychology? I mean, it drives me really nuts when people talk about, the mating strategies and things like that, treating human beings as mindless, choiceless animals. Jordan Peterson tends to be a little better than that when he talks about these issues. And he tends to talk about much more of the subtleties between men and women and the kind of what they bring out in each other, right? And the fact that women, and let's be clear, men and women are very different. Very different. Exactly in what sense are they very different is... Robert says, I spoke at the 21 convention, which promotes hypergamy. I spoke at the 21 convention when I didn't quite know what they were advocating. I was always a little wary and, suspicious. I don't think I would do it today. Speak at that convention. And I certainly never advocated for hypergamy when I spoke there. I didn't advocate for any of the stuff around this kind of issue. It's not what I talk about. And it's not what I believe. And I'm about, it was a great talk that I gave at the 21 convention because I talked about being selfish. I talked about what that means. And I talked about, even in relationships, I talked about what it means in relationships to be selfish. And in that sense, what I talked about was about values, about finding somebody who reflects your values, who gives you visibility into your values, who shares your values, chosen values, rational values, life-promoting values, not random values, not emotion-driven values. But the whole point of being human is to guide your values using your mind, using reason. Guide your mind using reason, in choosing your values. Guide your life using reason, choosing your values. Values, making sure that the values you choose are life-promoting. And that is true of a spouse. You want a spouse that promotes your life, not promotes your life in the sense of how many dollars are they going to provide me? Although, physical well-being is important, material well-being is important. But how do they promote your life in every aspect of your life? In the home realm of what is possible. Imagine being married to somebody who didn't like the artwork that you liked, didn't like at all the music you liked, didn't like at all the paintings or sculpture or movies you liked. I mean, it would be really, really, really bad. Even if they were great looking. Even if they made a lot of money. I mean, it's one of the challenges, particularly as you become an objectivist, is how do you find somebody who shares your values given what a minority we are? And luckily, there are a lot of people out there who are not philosophical and not objectivist who still have good values. But it's hard. That's the real challenge. That's what people should get advice on, is how to find people who share your values. And how to help people, because one of the things our educational system does, one of the things our culture does, it doesn't do, is it doesn't help people discover their values. It doesn't help people define their values. And as a consequence, there's so many people out there who just don't know what their values are and don't know how to think about their values. Art is a good example. They've never been exposed to art. They've never thought about art. They've never considered art. So one of the ways to try to find somebody to love, to care for, is to, not in an obnoxious way, but to help educate them, to help them discover their values. Now, a relationship like that would only survive if they actually do discover the values and it turns out that you share them, and it's done in a first-handed way. They're not just doing it to please you. And so, yeah, I mean, again, to the extent that the social sciences ignore free will, to the extent that they ignore reason, they're not very valuable. Not very valuable. And the whole study of men and women is problematic because of that, and the differences between men and women. What do you study? Do you study the average? So, on average, men are pursue these kind of things and women pursue those kind of things. Do you just pick the rational and compare rational women and rational men? I mean, that would be hard to do. Do you study, do you try to find a causal relationship that relates the biological differences in men and women to the value choices, the context difference between men and women? Because men and women are different psychologically. They're different. To what extent? I mean, to me, you'd have to understand the causal relationships. And then you'd have to study them at their best. And you'd have to control for things like culture. And even when control for culture, for example, in Scandinavia, was supposedly, I don't know if this is true, the educational system and everything else is geared towards equality between the sexes. There are vast differences between women and men. They choose different professions. They just have, they're different. Men and women are different. It's a metaphysical fact. And so you have to control for, so it's very difficult scientifically to, and given our limited knowledge of psychology, and given the field's limited knowledge of understanding of the role of free will and reason, it's very difficult to know what the real differences actually are between men and women and how they manifest themselves. Controlling for all the factors. So while there's no question that men and women are different, in what ways exactly? And in what ways they must be different, that is, they're different in a sense metaphysically, I think we're far from being able to define that, to describe that, to understand that, qua rational being, qua what we could and should be as human beings. Somebody asks, is the value of marrying somebody beautiful and rich bad? Well, if that's why you're marrying them, then yes, it's bad. Because you'll have a dull life. They won't be beautiful forever, for example. And money does not, in and of itself, buy happiness. So, yes, it's bad to categorize people based on beauty and on wealth as targets for, romantic engagement. It's unhealthy because it ignores what's important. Their mind, their values, the kind of human being that they are. Beauty is to a large extent an accident of birth. It's not chosen. So to marry somebody just because they're beautiful or rich is just pure materialism. Now, if they're beautiful and rich and they're wonderful and they share your values and everything, of course there's nothing wrong with that. So you don't disqualify people because they're beautiful and rich. But that's not the standard. And it shocks me that rational people think that it is, that there's this whole male-dominated movement that is trying to find, that is women based on looks. It ignores the nature, it ignores human nature, which is as a spiritual, rational being. All right, let me see if any of these other questions. All right. Next topic. So I want to talk a little bit about what's going on in Chile and connect it to what's going on in Brazil. It's a completely different topic. So we're back to politics and economics. So let me just close some of these windows related to hypergamy. Hypergamy, close, bring up the window for the Chile. There we go, we got Chile. So for those of you who maybe are not aware, Chile has been a country that's been considered this amazing economic phenomena. During the 1980s, early 80s, the then dictator of Chile, Pinochet, military dictator, out of an act of desperation because the economy was doing very, very badly and his standing was suffering as a consequence, Pinochet appointed to run the economy a group of young economists who had been trained in Chicago and therefore were basically free market economists. And not because he believed in free markets, but because these were the last men standing, in a sense. And he handed over the economy to them, and basically what they did was over the next 10 years, they deregulated, freed up the economy, lower taxes, privatized, massive overhaul of the Chilean economy. And it created at the end of the day, it turned Chile from the poorest country in Latin America to the richest country in Latin America on a per capita GDP. They privatized their social security system. They privatized their minerals industries. They completely radically reformed the economy. Now, it never became a laissez-faire capitalist place. Just relative to Latin America, it became the freest country in Latin America from an economic perspective. And indeed, at some point, Pinochet, there was pressure on Pinochet to leave. He was the dictator. The idea was, okay, the economy's doing well. Now, granted, Pinochet was a brutal dictator. He killed a lot of people. Bad guy. Really bad guy. But how many bad guys do this? He said, you know what? If the people really want me to leave, I will leave. And he had a referendum. And the referendum was, yes, stay, no, I leave, and we have elections. And they had this massive referendum in Chile, and the people voted for him to leave. And he left. He left. Which is unusual for a dictator. Dictators don't usually do that. So, as bad as he was not as bad as some. Now, Chile has done very well. The poor in Chile, the rate of poverty, the rate of absolute poverty, the rate of relative poverty has declined dramatically over these years. And again, Chile has become, on a per capita GDP basis, the richest country in Latin America. The poor in Chile do better than the poor in any other Latin American country. And Chile was growing until about 5-6 years ago at over 5% GDP growth a year. It had a robust economy, and it was growing fantastic. Over the last few years, Chilean economy has taken a relative beating. It is now growing more like the United States, so maybe a little less than the United States, at around 1.7%. And wage growth has gone down significantly, right? And recently, a few months back, demonstrations started in Chile, starting out, I think it was in October, starting out because of a price increase on public transportation that the government had put in, and it was a small price increase, and it was insignificant. And now, all hell has broken out in Chile. There are demonstrations in the streets almost daily. There's looting, there's violence, $2 billion in lost damages, 1,200 looted retail stores, 300,000 new unemployed because of the economy has suffered because of all these demonstrations, 25 people dead, 2,000 injured. That's just police officers. And a political and economic crisis that has no end in sight. And the question is why? And people say, look, people are unhappy with capitalism. People are unhappy with reforms. People, in spite of the fact that they're richer, they feel poor. Because inequality is high. Because things are terrible. Capitalism has failed in Chile. And there's a good op-ed in the Wall Street Journal on January 1st by Axel Kaiser, who is a free market thinker in Chile. I actually spoke for his think tank when I was in Chile earlier this year and just before the demonstration started in September. I seem to be everywhere before demonstrations started. I was in Hong Kong like a week before the demonstration started. I was in Chile about 2 weeks before they started. I don't know, I must be leaving some kind of vibe in these places. I'm starting to get me worried. So people are using this as an example, and they're saying this is obviously an example of failure. And what Axel Kaiser is pointing out is, yes, it is a failure. But it is not a failure of capitalism. It's not a failure of markets. It's not a failure of all the good things that have happened. Indeed, it is a failure of two things. One, the economic policies in Chile over the last primarily 5-6 years, instigated primarily in the second term of the previous president, Bachelet was her name, who was an explicit socialist, who increased corporate taxes by 30%, signed a law banning the replacement of workers on strike, thus increasing the cost of labor, increasing public spending at 3 times the economic growth rate, and unleashing armies of regulatory bureaucrats on the private sector. So part of the problem is they've had a socialist president. And then they voted her out of power, and they brought in the previous president, the president who had been there before her, who'd actually done a pretty decent job back then. But since he's come into power, Mr. Piñera, who is the current president, who is the brother of Jose Piñera, the guy who actually privatized Social Security in Chile, has done very little to reverse any of these things, indeed quite the contrary. He's failed miserably to move the country towards more free markets. Indeed, he's cemented much of the socialist reforms that Ms. Bachelet put into place. So over the last 5 to 8 years, the country has moved steadily, systematically, aggressively away from free markets. And what we're seeing are the consequence of that. But what I like about this op-ed by Axel Kaiser is that he understands that people are not just moved by the economic reality that they face. They are moved by ideas. And the people who move them are the intellectuals. And what he says is that it's not primarily the bad policies that have got Chile to where it is today. But it's the narrative. It is the story. It is the explanation that the intellectuals and the elites, the media personalities, the intellectuals, the business leaders, the politicians and the celebrities in Latin America, the narrative that they have provided for what is going on. For 20 years, these intellectuals and celebrities have been telling the Chilean people that Chile is an example of extreme injustice, that inequality is horrible and evil, and even though the poor are doing better off, inequality is unjust, and therefore the system that brought about this wealth to the poor people and to all Chileans is unjust. It began, of course, at universities, where these things always begin, where these leftist ideologues preach the gospel of evil inequality and the evil of economic liberty under the guise of neoliberalism and the evil that it creates. Not that it doesn't provide the goods, but that it does it in an unjust way. That it is fundamentally unjust because equality is the standard. They are fundamentally egalitarians. So Axel Kaiser understands that the real enemy is egalitarianism and the embracing of egalitarianist ideology by the elites, by the elites to communicate, by the intellectuals, by the celebrities, by the media personalities, and importantly, by the business leaders. Now note the parallel with the United States. People are being told that the system is unjust, that the system is unfair, that the system is no good, that the real evil is not poverty. The real evil is inequality. The real evil is not coercion and force. The real evil is inequality. Now note that this is the rhetoric all over the West. It's in our universities. It's among our business leaders. It's everywhere. And indeed, I believe that much of what is going on today in the country, in the U.S., and in places like France, where you're seeing the yellow vests out in the streets, and the frustration in much of Europe, is that people have bought into this. If intellectuals say over and over and over again that inequality is bad, that the middle class has suffered, that the working class is being screwed, data doesn't matter. Facts don't matter anymore. They have shaped the culture. As I said before, many people just don't think. Thinking is an effort. And what this leads people to is frustration, alienation, anger, a sense of injustice. And they're willing to go out into the streets, whether it's the yellow vest in France, millions in Chile, or the working class in the United States ready to vote for Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump. But it's a consequence of being told that they're poor more than it is of them being poor. It's a consequence of them being told that it's immoral, of them being told that capitalism has failed, even though capitalism is not being tried. So when economic crisis happens in Chile, it's not the statist policies of these presidents, of the latest governments that's being blamed on. No, the elites again blame capitalism for everything. When Venezuela collapses, it's not socialism that's blamed. No, it's the remnant of private property. Intellectuals matter. Intellectuals shape the world. They shape people's thinking. In a world in which people are not trained to think for themselves. In a world in which many people choose not to think for themselves. Intellectuals guide them. And the intellectuals we have today have betrayed the people, particularly the poor. Because they are telling them there's something more important than their poverty to overcome. It's the inequality. And by doing that, they're institutionalizing them into poverty. They're destroying economies. They're destroying the ability to be successful. And indeed, what is the government's response in Chile? The government's response is more social programs, higher taxes, more government spending, more health insurance schemes, more appeasement, more buying off, more bribing people to be quiet, which will only make things worse and worse and worse. Basically, they have given up the moral high ground. They've given up the moral high ground to the worst of the worst. And in Chile, according to Axel, it's worse than that because it's not just in economics. The Chilean elites are waging a sustained war against law enforcement. So police officers don't dare act because they're afraid of the media. They're afraid of the elites. They're even afraid of being punished in the courts. So that violence is rampant. Violence is tolerated. Public disorder, crime are tolerated. Because the poor, the unequal, are justified in the face of this horrible injustice. So free markets don't fail. They certainly didn't fail in Chile. And law and order could be reinstated in Chile. What have failed are the ideas of the left. What has failed are the ideas of the statists, left and right. What has failed is the egalitarian ideas and the ideas of a mixed economy. Liberalizing and then moving back a little bit, and liberalizing and moving back a little bit, and this pendulum bouncing back and forth does not work. It creates frustration, it creates hostility, and ultimately creates riots in the streets. And we're seeing that We're seeing that everywhere. We're seeing frustration, alienation, anger all over the West. And that will not go away until we change our ideas, we change the narrative, we change the explanation. We abandon egalitarianism, we abandon the rhetoric of inequality. It won't change until we replace our intellectuals with people who respect the individual, not the collective and the state. With intellectuals who respect the mind, not just the animal within us. Somebody asked about thinking and free will. I don't think there's such a thing as thinking without free will. There's no such thing as thinking, logic, reason without free will. The whole process of reasoning, figuring out what is right and what is useful and what is not, what is a fact and what is not, what is a relevant fact and what is not a relevant fact. All of that are acts of will that involve choices. You cannot have thinking without free will. You cannot have reason without free will. Okay. Let's focus. Oh, I want to talk about Brazil. So Brazil is in this dilemma. This is the challenge that faces Brazil. Brazil is where Chile was maybe 30 years ago. Brazil has just appointed a minister of economics who is a free market kind of Chicago boy. I think he was trained in Chicago. Brazil has an opportunity to rise up like Chile from an economic perspective. And let's really hope that they take advantage of that opportunity. The people in charge of the economy in Brazil right now are pretty good. The president, Bolsonaro, is weak. He's a nationalist, a collectivist, not particularly a free market guy. But he has been sidelined for the most part. He has been sidelined for the most part in economics by the free market group. So Brazil really has a chance to succeed like Chile did economically. But what I'd like to see is that Brazil do more than that. That Brazil also adopt a moral view of free markets. Also adopt a philosophical, ideological view of free markets. So that it is a one-way street towards liberalization and freedom rather than a pendulum which goes nowhere. What Brazilian businessmen, all businessmen everywhere need is they need the moral certainty, the moral knowledge of the virtue of what they did. Not the virtue of what they do just because it helps other people. But because what business is a manifestation of human reason. In order to improve human survival. It is virtuous not only because it helps the other, but primarily because it helps self. It is a manifestation of the application of your individual reason in solving the problem of survival for you and for others. That's what makes business moral. A moral activity. That morality, that confidence in the virtue of capitalism, not only in its materialistic success, is what Brazil needs. Brazil needs an injection of Ayn Rand, an injection of the morality of capitalism in order not only to embrace the market system economically, but to embrace the market system morally and philosophically. And if it does, the upside in Brazil is massive. Is massive. And I have to say that objectivism is doing very well in Brazil. The books are translated, Ayn Rand's books are translated in Brazil. They're selling quite well. There's a lot of energy, a lot of excitement. I get large audiences when I go to Brazil to talk about objectivism. Brazil might be one of the better places to be an objectivist. It might be primed right now to hear a voice of reason, to hear a moral voice defending capitalism and ethical foundation. So go Brazil. Is it safe? Somebody asked if it's safe to go to Brazil. You have to be alert. You have to know what you're doing. You have to be careful. There is still a problem of violence in Brazil. All right. Super chat questions. Let's see. Can putting effort into being attractive be a virtue? Or can it be just materialistic? No, I think it's definitely a virtue. It doesn't have to be a virtue. You have to choose it as a virtue. So it's not kind of a universal. But being attractive, I think within the scope of what is possible for you, given how you were born, is definitely a virtue. It's a sense of, we all want to surround ourselves with beauty. We all want to give a sense that we are the most beautiful we can be, or given the other options we have to do with our time and how much effort we want to put into it. It shouldn't be a central focus in your life. It shouldn't be a central purpose in your life. But as a value, on top of many other values, taking care of yourself, looking good, not just for health reasons, but for aesthetic reasons, is definitely a value. Dressing nicely, or at least reasonably nicely, and just taking care of yourself. Both in terms of diet and in terms of looks and in terms of clothes and things like that. It's definitely a virtue. It's not a top virtue. It's not a super important virtue. But it is a virtue, partially because when you look in the mirror, you don't want to be, you want to encounter generally beauty around you to the extent that you can. So within the confines of your biology, absolutely, it can be a virtue and not just purely materialistic and be pleasurable to look good. But once it becomes an obsession, it becomes Louis says it's a reflection of pride and self-esteem, and I think that's right. But once it becomes an obsession, once it becomes your primary value, the thing you motivates you during the day, the thing that really upsets you if you can't attain it, and so on, then it drives, then it's purely materialistic. Purely materialistic. Right? And again, you should decide what you like, what looks good on you, what you looking good means. Somebody says it would be so good if Yaron could speak Spanish and Portuguese. I agree, but it ain't happening. All right, what is the likelihood of Ben Shapiro becoming president in the future? Would you view that as a very positive sign for the future? I think the likelihood of Ben Shapiro becoming president in the U.S. is very low, very low. I just don't see it happening. As much as Ben Shapiro is charismatic and well-spoken, he's too radical on certain things, on economics, for people to actually vote for. He's too religious on the religious side for people to vote for. He'd alienate too many people, in my view, to be able to be electable, both for good reason and for bad reason. He'd alienate too many people. So I don't see it. Would you view it as a positive sign? It depends why they elected him. If they elect him primarily for his positive views, like his more economic views, then then I think it would be a positive sign. If they elect him because they want a religionist who's anti-abortion, then it would be a negative sign. So it really would depend on what they elected him. I think generally, if they elect Orthodox Jew, I think there's something positive in that, in and of itself. Just from a wariness about anti-Semitism. One of the reasons I don't think it could happen is I do think there's anti-Semitism, too much of him to get somebody as explicitly Jewish as he is to do. But I also think both on the virtue and the vice side, he's just too extreme to be elected. If I devised a way to do it, say through technology, would it be immoral to capitalize profit off the homeless? No, I don't see why it would be. If for example, you could sell the homeless something, or if you could find a solution to get the homeless a off the streets and make money while you did that, why would it be immoral? I mean, if you're exploiting the homeless, that is, if you're proposing a win-lose proposition, then I think it's immoral. I think selling cocaine to people is immoral. Because you're not creating value. Now, that shouldn't be illegal, but it's not an industry that's admirable because it's a win-lose kind of industry. Inherently. So no, as long as it's win-win, as long as you're winning and your customer's winning, i.e. the homeless in this case, then I don't see why it would be immoral if you're making money. Moving to St. Louis, your standard shouldn't be their need. That's altruism. That's altruism. The standard should be value creation and mutual consent, and mutual win-win. That's the standard, not somebody else's need, and therefore, if you're so-called taking advantage of their need, you're being immoral. No, absolutely not. That's why I'm not against gouging. If there's a hurricane about to hit and everybody's driving away and you own a gas station and you jack up prices to $20 a gallon, that is not immoral. That is not immoral. Quite the contrary, it serves an important economic need, and that is that you basically people who need the gasoline most will pay the most for it. So price gouging is absolutely immoral. It serves an important economic need, function, not need, and it doesn't treat your relationship with other people as sacrificial. It treats your relationship with other people as a trader relationship, as a win-win relationship. Those people who don't buy your gasoline at $20 a barrel, a gallon, don't value it at $20 a gallon, therefore they don't buy it. So that's fine. Only the people who value it at $20 a gallon will buy it. Moving to St. Louis for my first job as a manufacturer engineer after graduation in May. Advice in moving to a new city and finding like-minded people. I mean, it's a challenge. I mean, you might want to check out to see if there's an objectivist club, or if there's a Facebook page. You might want to put something on Facebook to figure out if there are any like-minded people on there. And like-minded people in what sense? I'm not sure who asked the question. So you might contact the Ayn Rand Institute if you're an objectivist and ask them if there are any people at St. Louis who wouldn't mind sharing their email addresses or where there might be activity going on. You might try to come to some objectivist conferences to try to meet people who live close by to where you live. I don't have any special strategies for how to do that. Those are just some things off the top of my head. And then think about the values that are important to you and pursue those values. And then you'll meet people, hopefully in pursuit of those values, who share those values with you. Oh, Jacob, I guess I don't know you, Jacob, so I can't comment, but I mean, really pursue your values and see who else shows up, in a sense. Or if you want to organize an objectivist get-together, then do it and advertise on Facebook and see who shows up. Now, just be wary. The fact that somebody else calls himself an objectivist, the fact that somebody else is a fan of Ayn Rand, doesn't mean they're a good person. Doesn't mean they should be your friends. Doesn't mean anything about them other than they like Ayn Rand. So that's just the first step. Shouldn't be automatic. But use whatever resources. I think social media is a good resource for kind of out there asking questions. This chat here is a good resource for saying, hey, I'm moving to St. Louis. Anybody know anybody in St. Louis who might be interested in getting together? Use the web in those kind of ways. All right, the last question is somebody's asking for hitchhiking stories. I don't know. I'd hate to bore you guys, but maybe at some point I can bring a glass of wine to one of my podcasts, and while I'm sipping a glass of wine, I'll tell you hitchhiking stories. But I did hitchhike when I was 18 from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. I basically went out on Route 10 outside of in L.A. with a big backpack, sleeping bag and backpack all rolled up. Stuck my thumb out and hitchhiked. And took me, I think, 3 nights. Yes, 3 nights, 1, 2, 3. Basically 3 days to get to New Orleans. I spent a few days in New Orleans and then hitchhiked in 2 days to Washington, D.C. During the trip, I was propositioned several times for sex with other men. I was invited to people's homes that were incredibly nice. People tried to drive away with my backpack a couple of times. Thought I was going to be raped at least once. Jumped out of a moving car once. Got picked up by a underground poet from San Francisco who wanted me to drive, and on and on. So we could get into the details of the stories. That could be fun sometimes, but I have to be in the right mood. I have to have a glass of wine. I have to be, in a storytelling mood. I can also tell you stories about hiking in Israel, about the Israeli military, about driving like a maniac in Beirut, about, in Beirut, about landmines, thinking I was walking through a landmine, hiking in the desert and getting lost. I've got a lot of stories from my youth. I've lived an interesting life. So, if we land up hanging out at some point, and I'm not from South Africa. Somebody says I'm from South Africa. My parents are from South Africa. I have played cricket in my life. I don't like the game. I don't understand the game. I used to, but I don't anymore. Was any of this inspired by Kerouac on the road? No, I never read Kerouac. I never liked Kerouac. I was never a beatnik. At 18, I considered myself, I'd read Ayn Rand. I wouldn't consider myself an objectivist. I didn't know what objectivism was. But I'd read fiction and nonfiction by Ayn Rand. I can implicitly consider myself a follower of Ayn Rand's philosophy. I'd internalized that. And I still hitchhiked across the United States. Most of the time with a knife in my sock, ready to stab anybody who would jump me. Think of it this way. I was 18. I was about to go back to Israel, where I was about to join the army, which in those days meant I had a non-zero probability of not surviving. I, at that point in time, thought that I was going to be joining the Israeli Navy SEALs. I don't know what the survival rate in the SEALs in those days was, but it was a non-zero probability that I would not survive to see the age 21. I was in a bit of a hedonistic mood, given that. I was not looking forward to going back to Israel and joining the military. But I thought I had no choice in a sense, or I could have stayed in America, but I had no visa, I had nothing. I could have been an illegal, which I wouldn't have minded, but I could have never gone back to Israel, could have never seen my family. It would have been hugely consequential, and at 18, I was not ready to make that move. So I went back to Israel to join the army. I didn't want to go back, and I had been with a friend, and we had basically driven. We had done, I think, over 10,000 miles, I think 20,000 miles, zigzagging the United States, going to every national park, hiking in all the national parks. And I didn't want to go back to Israel, and I didn't have any money. And I didn't want to ask my parents for money. There's a concept, a young man not wanting to ask his parents for money. So I basically took a little bit of the money I have for food, and I went hitchhiking, because that was the only way to get around. I wanted to see New Orleans for some bizarre reason. New Orleans was the one place in the United States that I'd never been to, and I heard it was this amazing place, and I want to go see it. It turned out to be a dump, horrible, and I didn't enjoy myself at all. But there you go. I think that's as much hitchhiking stories as we're going to hear today. But one of these days, or if you catch me in person sometime, and we're sitting, and I've got a glass of wine in my hand, I'd be happy to tell you stories. I have a lot of stories. People find them entertaining. I just can't see myself wasting your time on my podcast to do it, and I don't have that glass of wine with me. So it takes a certain mood. It takes a certain mood. Somebody says maybe I should just do a show of it. I can sit, usually I do my show standing up. I can sit, I can have a glass of wine, I can be sipping it while I'm doing the show. And actually, Brad Thompson also hitchhiked when he was young. Maybe we can do it together. Me and Brad doing a couple of objectivist intellectuals, before they were intellectuals, hitchhiking across America. All right, guys. We'll have to set a date for that sometime. Talk to you all soon. Oh, tomorrow. Tomorrow's the big show. Tomorrow I'm doing a show with Onkar Gate and Greg Salameri on the Enlightenment, and in particular about the video that Prager University put out on the Enlightenment, narrated by Yoram Chazoni, who gets basically everything wrong in the video, or much of it wrong in the video. But actually, I think Steven Pinker's at fault here a little bit as well. So we'll have an opportunity to critique Steven Pinker's view of the Enlightenment as well. And I'm going to talk about the stuff I know best, and I'm going to let Greg and Anka talk about the philosophy, the stuff they know best. And I think it's going to be really, really interesting and really, really good. I think both Greg and Anka are some of the smartest guys I know and some of the best philosophers I know. And we're going to be talking about Kant, and we're going to be talking about Rousseau, and we're going to be talking about Enlightenment philosophers like Locke, and all of that stuff. And I know we're going to be talking about Rand's view of Kant, and whether Kant and Rousseau were Enlightenment philosophers, as both Yoram Chazoni and Steven Pinker think. All right, guys. Have a great rest of your weekend. See you tomorrow. It'll be at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. Don't forget to press the like button. It doesn't cost you anything. It doesn't let the world know you listen to me. You just press the like button, and it helps my algorithm reach within YouTube. And of course, if you're so inclined, please share the program. And if you get value, I'd appreciate you showing value in return by either contributing something through the super chat or going to my website, yaronbrookshow.com/support, and contributing something over there. Thank you, everybody. Talk to you tomorrow. Bye.